Hello and welcome to this lecture series on the new imperialism. This is part one, global imperialism. Now, before we take a look at global imperialism, we need to take a minute to kind of dispel the myths around Americans' anti-imperialistic history. The United States was born out of an anti-colonial revolt against an imperialistic founding country, right? We were colonies of Great Britain. We ultimately revolted and we declared independence. And from that, we have a tendency to adopt this idea that the United States has always been anti-imperialistic and isolationist. And neither one of these things are actually true, right? And the reason why we tend to have this mindset is that we have a tendency to associate imperialism with colonialism, which are two separate things, right? The United States has been imperialistic from its very foundings. Think about it. During the American Revolution, we are actually going to go so far as to attempt to invade Canada and try and add Canada as part of our revolution, right? That is not something that somebody that's anti-imperialistic is going to do. After we were established as a nation, we immediately began spreading westward across the continent. And we knew we were going to do that from the very start. John Adams would actually write after the Lee Resolution was approved on July 2nd, 1776, the real Declaration of Independence, that day, the day of our independence, ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. He was literally saying that this is going to be a continental empire. And we immediately began positioning ourselves towards that goal, right? You have the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the American Revolution and extended our border to the Mississippi River. In 1803, we purchased Louisiana from France, extending our borders further. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 was recognized by Spain, and it created an American border recognized by a foreign nation that touched the Pacific Ocean because Spain recognized our claims on Oregon territory, right? This claim would be globally recognized by the Treaty of Washington of 1846, right? The Texas Admission Act added Texas to the nation and led to a war with Mexico, which added even more territory. And then finally, you have the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, which rounds out the shape and form of the continental United States. This is all imperialism, right? It's often not seen that way, though, and there's a couple reasons for that. First reason we have a tendency not to see this imperialism as imperialism is that the expansion across the continent was framed in the under the idea of divine right, this concept that we call manifest destiny, right? Manifest, of course, meaning obvious, and destiny meaning inevitable. It was inevitable for us to create a continental empire. And the second reason that American imperialism is often not considered that way is that it wasn't colonialism. Like I said, we have a tendency to associate imperialism with colonialism. When you take a look at the territories we added them with a process, thanks to the Northwest ordinances, that allowed them to eventually become an equal partner, right? In a colonial system, that never happens, right? The Massachusetts colony was never going to become an equal partner to the mother country of England. But Ohio, when it became a state carved out of the Northwest territory, it became an equal partner with the original 13 colonies. So it doesn't feel as imperialistic. Now, that said, in the late 1800s, you're going to see Europe embark on a whole new round of imperialism, right? Because by the late 1870s, Europe had pretty much divested themselves of all of its territorial holdings, or at least the majority of its territorial holdings in the Americas. And those territorial holdings had created economic models for those European nations, which they'd become dependent on, right? That your colonial American holdings would be used as sources of raw materials that would be brought back to the mother country to manufactured finished goods that would then be turned around and sold internationally, but a lot back to the original colonial territories, right? Well, you divested yourself from that American territory. Now you got to find new markets. And so that's going to lead to a whole new round of imperialistic expansion in Africa and Asia, right? Between 1881 and 1914, there's going to be a scramble in Africa to colonize almost every square foot of that continent. For example, in 1881, the Treaty of Bordeaux will give France territorial claims over Algeria and Tunisia. In 1882, Britain will invade Egypt. In 1883, France will invade Madagascar. In 1884, you're going to have Germany annex Togo, Cameroon, and Angria-Pingina. And also that year, you are going to have the West African Conference, also known as the Berlin Conference, which was held to settle colonial disputes amongst the European powers throughout the rest of Africa, right? This had to do with what was going to be the disposition of the region known as the Congo, which initially was claimed by Portugal, but through the West African Conference will be given to Belgium. It'll become the Belgian Congo, right? So by the time World War I started on the African continent, the only two independent nations left on the entire continent is Abyssinia, right, Ethiopia, and Liberia, that nation that was actually created by colonization societies in America during the American Civil War, right? In Asia, you're going to have the same thing happen. You're going to have the British create colonies in India, Burma, Malaysia, North Borneo, and even parts of Iran, right? Modern-day Indonesia was controlled by the Dutch. It was called the Dutch East Indies. France is going to establish a colony in Southeast Asia and call it French Indochina. It's today part of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and we are definitely going to talk about that again, right? And even Japan, which is going to begin industrialize, something we'll talk about later, is going to get involved, and they are going to acquire Korea and the island of Formosa, right? Korea by 1910 will be a Japanese protectorate state. Now, the one last elephant in the room that we haven't talked to through all this is China. China is going to prove to be a little bit more difficult because it's quite literally too big to conquer. Any one European nation is not going to just colonize it. What's going to happen in China instead is there's going to be the creation of spheres of influence. There's going to be conflicts between China and European nations are going to lead to the establishment of these different spheres of influence, exclusive trading zones. For example, Britain, through two opium wars, the Opium War and the Arrow War in the 1800s, are going to get possession of Stanley Island, where they'll build the city of Hong Kong, and get exclusive trading rights with the city across the way called Guangzhou, right? It used to be called Canton, and also would get a sphere of influence over Tibet and the Yangtze River Valley, which would include cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, right? France is going to get a sphere of influence over the river basin north of French Indochina. Russia is going to get a sphere of influence over North China, the area known as Manchuria, and even Mongolia. And Japan will also share that influence over Manchuria. Even Germany is going to get in on the act here. Germany is going to actually get a sphere of influence in China on the Shandong Peninsula, where they will build the colonial city called Tsingtao, right? Tsingtao is spelled like it sounds, Qingdao, right? And they would immediately start brewing beer, right? And even today, you can purchase, it's run, of course, by China now, you can purchase Tsingtao beer from specialty grocery stores, and if you do, you'll drink some of the most awful beer ever created. Now, you'll notice that the United States is absent from this imperialism frenzy. It's not because it's anti-imperialist, though. There's a few reasons driving it. First of all, in the mid to late 1800s, the United States is dealing with a lot of its own internal problems, right? It's fought the Civil War, and now it's trying to recover from that. It's embarking on its industrial revolution. And even though it's going to build an industrial base that would be perfect for imperialistic ambitions, it's not going to have a military that's going to be up to that challenge, right? In the 1890s, the United States Army only had less than 30,000 soldiers in it. That's really small. To put that in perspective, today in South Korea, there's more U.S. troops in South Korea today than the entirety of the U.S. Army here in the 1890s. Okay, Switzerland in the 1890s had a larger army than the United States. The United States ranked 17th in the world as far as armies go. And its navy was even smaller. Its Navy only had 30 combat vessels that were ready for action and less than 10,000 soldiers. Again, to put this in perspective, the Royal Navy at this time had over 300 combat ships. It was over 10 times larger, right? Now, it doesn't mean that the United States didn't have a will to become a superpower, a will to become imperialistic. Matter of fact, people like Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a military strategist, would write about this. How would a nation become a global power? And he said the way you had to do it was by creating lines of communication. In 1875, he published a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this book has a lot of stuff in it. Military strategy for naval vessels. Matter of fact, the military strategy was adopted by pretty much every large navy in the world and held on to actually for a long time. When we think about World War II, for example, we have a tendency to think of the Japanese Navy as being this, a navy based on air power, right? We think of Yamamoto Uesuruku and the carrier fleets and the attack on Pearl Harbor, Midway. The majority of Japanese naval admirals during World War II were battleship admirals that still adhered to the Mahanian strategy that you needed to have large military fleets with battleships and lured the enemy into your own home waters where your logistics line were short and theirs were long for one big decisive battle, right? Yamamoto was the outlier. He wasn't the norm, right? The Kaiser of Germany required that this book be on every single one of the ships of the Kriegsmarine, right? So anyways, like I said, Mahan said in order to become a global power, you had to create lines of communication. So you had to create a large merchant marine to engage in copious amounts of trade across these oceans. And if you're going to have a large merchant marine, then you have to have a large navy in order to protect these transport ships. And therefore, you need to have forward bases where you can refit and repair and refuel these naval vessels. He referred to them as forward coaling stations. Ships in 1875, when this is published, were pretty much all converting over to coal-fired boilers, right? And so this idea of coaling stations just basically means forward military bases, okay? The United States does have designs to try and create this model outlined by Mahan. And one of the first places where this is going to happen is through some pretty strange machinations that led to the annexation of Hawaii,